Welcome to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Markle. I'm a curriculum development specialist here at NCBRT, and I work in collaboration with subject matter experts to create valuable and timely training for the responder community. The National Center for Biomedical Research and Training provides mobile training to both the national and international emergency response community. Today on the podcast, we're talking to Todd Short and Eric Vandenburg about all things preparedness for public events. I'll let them introduce themselves. Thank you so much for joining us today. Eric, you want to take it away?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Eric Vandenburg. I am a retired detective from the New York City Police Department. We dealt with quite a lot of gatherings, celebrations, parade in New York City over the many years. So we'll talk about some of that today.
And my name's Todd
All right,
Short.
go ahead, Todd.
Sure. In my prior life, I was the deputy chief of police at the University of Illinois. And longer story short, once I locked that particular pension in, I took whatever talents I had left to Lakeland College in Mattoon, Illinois. And right now I'm their training sergeant and emergency operations center manager and emergency preparedness planner.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. So to start us off, let's go ahead and define kind of what events we're talking about today.
Eric, go ahead.
Jump in.
Todd, you want to take it first?
Sure.
This is how it always starts.
It's quite the icebreaker.
Well, I mean, if we look at today's world and some of the things that are going on, we typically have holiday gatherings, celebrations, but now, because of a lot of geopolitical events that are happening in the world, we tend to get a lot of demonstrations. So we have to provide security for protesters and counter-protesters that might be showing up at some of these different events, and that's going to be a lot different overall from when you're dealing with friendly crowds that are showing up to celebrate holiday celebrations. So typically think of, for instance, being from New York City when we would host the Thanksgiving Day parade. Mm-hmm. Usually went off, everything, most of the people that would show up would be families, a lot of tourists who would come to watch the parade floats and, of course, at the end, see Santa Claus come down through the city. And then after the parade ended, everybody just went home. Now, you put on the other side another celebration, we'd have like New Year's Eve, where people would arrive in the mid-afternoon and they would stay till a little after midnight. People would be involved in drinking alcohol. It was a little bit rowdier, a little bit older crowd. So you had to work differently. Then you take protests, and now you're maybe dealing with people in a crowd who may want to incite violence. So you have to worry about how you police and secure a lot of these crowds for these different types of events.
Yeah, actually, I think Eric made a lot of good points there. There are so many things going on moving into 2024. I think historically when we talked about what kind of events do we want to plan for, we think about things like high-profile sporting events. Going into an election year, I think we have to expand our thought process and what we're planning for. Certainly, we've got a Super Bowl coming up. Things that come to my mind are large gathering events. Mardi Gras is right around the corner, of course. With the elections that are coming up in the fall of 24, we're sure to have all kinds of activity in various different venues throughout the country, leading I would imagine all 12 months of the year, at least in 2024 and afterwards. So there are so many different types of things that we have to think about now. Eric brought up the protesters versus counter-protesters issue. It's just not necessarily securing physical events now, but more, I would say, flexible issues like crowd control, crowd management, ingress, egress points. I would say the scope and the size and the complexity of what we're dealing with now is substantially different. and more complex than it was 25 years ago when I started doing this. Eric, would you agree?
And the fact that you have social media where you can put these messages out to people to expand who may show up. I think that's a thing that we hadn't dealt with in the past that we now have to deal with. You working on a college campus, I could imagine that some of the things that are happening in other countries are going to affect what happens on your campuses.
And Eric, some of the stuff we talk about, globally, just not at home, is the things that we see internationally, generally at some point in time could absolutely come home to roost here. So we're just not looking at things that are happening domestically, while they're absolutely and certainly important. We're also looking at things that are happening across the globe to see how events are being secured, how people are being formed, what their socio-political agendas may be, because so much of that translates at home.
We also have to worry about when you have counter protesters or you may have people who don't really appreciate security and the police, they may be looking to see how we prepare and what we do in advance prior to or during these events.
So many challenges now. Eric, when we first started doing this way back when, a security plan would probably include coming up with some kind of a schematic.
It's a long time ago.
I know it feels like it, where we're physically placing people at certain salient points that we think are going to secure some kind of a perimeter or a pseudo perimeter around an event. And now we have safety related challenges that are things, quite honestly, that we haven't had to deal with historically. I talked a little bit about crowd management earlier. The size and the scope and the complexity of the crowds that we're dealing with at certain events. It's got to be taken to an account because it only takes obviously one bad actor to do something silly, and so trying to pick those people out of a crowd becomes a very, very unique challenge for those in the safety and security realm. I think about challenges like vulnerable populations that may be participating in an event, whether it's a marathon, whether it's a cultural event, a political issue, whatever the case may be. We've seen time and time again and in various things that have occurred in our country where people were at the wrong place at the wrong time and suffered dire consequences just for being unlucky.
One of the things that you have to consider when you're looking at some of these events, I know when we talk about the site protection class, we're talking about sometimes you have to guard a building or a particular event that may be occurring in a building where you can really control some of the checkpoints and access and egress to those buildings. Whereas if you're talking about what you had mentioned, a marathon, now you have something spread over 26 miles that has to be secured with a lot of open target parades. Demonstrations can move. They can be mobile. They may not be just in one place. They can go from one place to another. If you're talking a college campus, it's very open. It's meant to be. So it's very difficult to be able to secure the entire perimeter for that particular location.
So true. So many of the places that we're charged with protecting don't necessarily have boundaries around them to keep bad players out or bad things from happening. And so to expand our view and our scope, I think it's become increasingly important because at the end of the day, when we're trying to plan for these types of events, we cannot become narrow focused because if we do, we're very likely to miss something. And if we do that, then everybody's going to lose, and that we can't have because that's unacceptable.
We also have to look at changes in tactics because when groups look at what failed in the past, they'll make changes and adjust and look at what we may have in place. We know that Boston in 2013 dealt with a bombing at their marathon. And then you can have using vehicles, for instance, that they did in France. If you're talking about trying to secure something the size of a marathon, you have to look at securing 26 miles and the thousands and thousands of people that are going to show up as spectators or people actually competing or as part of a parade, that all that has to be protected by security and law enforcement.
Yeah, it's well said, Eric. There's such a difference in trying to protect a fixed site versus a non-fixed site, a permanent versus a non-permanent site. And one of the things that keeps me up at night, I won't lie to you, I've lost sleep over it, is when you have a site that's expanded from point A to point Z, whether it's a mile or 26 and a quarter mile, whatever the case may be. My goodness gracious, the challenges that come with that are immense. Again, it's absolutely dramatically changed our focus. One of the other things that I would just mention, and it's always been a career frustration of mine, I I feel like there are times when we're always a quarter step behind the people that are planning to do nefarious things because we're in a constant state of learning from prior instances on what they've done so that we can try to secure our own practices. Whether it's a Virginia Tech and chaining doors, denying access to a Boston bombing where we've got some IEDs placed under, stadium stands with people in them, whatever the case may be. I think one of our greatest challenges that we have to address is thinking outside the box and escaping our own comfort zones as we try to strategize and use different types of tactics to think about the unthinkable. And if we can do that effectively moving forward, I think we're going to have a lot stronger chance to succeed getting away from the norm. It's absolutely so important to think about prior incidents and build upon them, but then also trying to predict things that could potentially happen that quite honestly a lot of people either don't want to think about and or don't want to address.
You basically have to take into account every option. One of the things, and I'll date myself by saying this, but back in 2004, when New York City hosted the Republican National Convention, I was part of a team, and we basically deemed the what if team. All right, what if this happens? How do we respond? And it could be from anything from somebody who brings a knife into the venue or somebody who unleashes a chemical weapon somewhere or an explosive device or using a vehicle to do so. So we had to look at every different angle of every different aspect. So we were the what if guys. What do we do? And that's thinking outside the box. That's what you have to do because you know that these guys are training to get around whatever we might put in place. So therefore, you're going to have visible security. You're also going to have to, very importantly, have invisible security.
And is that something that you've, sorry, the part about, visible and, undercover security, is that something that you even thought of before some of these events like the Boston bombing and whatnot? Is that something that, were you even thinking that deeply about it, putting all of these contingencies in place?
You can take this one first, Todd.
I would say yes and no, Ashley. And I would say yes because I think it's an issue that we've always thought about because there's advantages and disadvantages to both. I think one of the biggest advantages of having invisible security people at a venue is you can provide a visible deterrent before it begins. Another advantage is if you've got a secondary layer of invisibility, then those people can literally stay back in the shadows, take a 5,000-foot view, as opposed to the people that are uniformed up having a boots on the ground view. It provides a totally different perspective visually, aesthetically, and everything else to be able to really try to mitigate something. I think as a result of large-scale incidents that have occurred, we've had so many active shooter events. Eric mentioned marathons, including Boston was a great example of that. I think because of those types of incidents, it's not so much discussion or fodder anymore. I think it's beginning to become more in practice. Things like Overwatch teams, which are groups of people that perhaps have a different type of armament with them than a street level uniform presence, being at types of events to provide a different layered view of an event is absolutely put into practice now. Things like air monitoring stations at large scale events was not necessarily a common practice 20 or 25 years ago. But if we're asking people to be cognizant and vigilant if they see something out of place, like leaks, like potential fumes, those types of things. It makes absolute sense to have those kind of players in place beforehand because after something occurs, of course, then it's too late to react.
And I would add on top of that, technology.
Mhm.
We've learned, we've advanced with technology. And then going back to right after 9/11, creating marketing programs like See Something, Say Something, educating the public and empowering them to be able to do something, um, training them to know, listen, if you see this type of activity, this is something that you want to report. This is definitely suspicious. This could be dangerous. So by uh, putting that out there to the public and gaining their trust by working alongside with them and encourage them to report this type of information is going to be that has changed over the years, I think.
I think the social campaigns have been a big plus. Those simple slogans, to see something, say something that you see targeted every major United States citizen or in every United States city, while it seems very rudimentary, it does increase calls to local police departments, Crime Stoppers, those types of things. I don't think it's too much to say that at the end of the day, we talk about people in our communities being the first responders because nobody has any more intelligence than the people that live in those communities, that live in those neighborhoods, because they know what the norms are. They know what the baselines of behavior are. And I know that's an important part of what we talk about when we're preaching the site protection issue throughout the country and throughout the world. But when the hair on the back of somebody's neck stands up, that's when we absolutely have to be notified. How many times have we gotten reports, Eric, where somebody says, I saw that and it seemed a little bit out of place, and I talked to this person or that person, and we just decided to kind of see how that played out. We didn't want to bother you at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then, Eric, what's our standard response to something like that?
You should have said something.
At the end of the day, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Why don't you give us a call so we can go out and take a look at it? Because at the end of the day, I would much rather have come out and said, you're absolutely correct. It was nothing. Then have to come back and say, oh my goodness, that was actually
That's what
something.
we want to hear. Yeah. Better to be safe than sorry.
Every time.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but can we dive a little deeper into what it means to establish a baseline and why it's so important to do so?
I think it is important to establish a baseline so that you have something to work from. Once you know what the normal is for a given area, event, people will recognize a lot faster when something goes against that baseline.
Mm-hmm.
If we have programs in place that people can report it, hopefully they will do so.
Actually, I'll take it one step further. I'm still on the job, still wearing the uniform. And what I tell my people is pretty consistent. And that is, we got to be able to articulate why we did what we did with the information that we had at the time it was happening. Because we're usually judged in 2020 hindsight. And that's an interesting lens to be seen through. So from a liability standpoint, from a doing the right thing for the right reason standpoint, it's incredibly important for us to ask questions, to make our own observations, to establish those baselines so that I can put on paper in a report that's going to be read by a state's attorney and or prosecuted that these actions were taken. We went out, we spoke with these people who were eventually detained and or arrested because of A, B, and C or X, Y, and Z. We had a reasonable articulation, reasonable suspicion to be able to go and make a decisive act, to be able to try to detect or deter or defend, whatever the case may be. Baselines are something that, from my perspective, is, to me, it's like being on the 50-yard line of a probable cause field, Eric. So if I'm standing in the middle of the field, I want to be able to look left or right towards both end zones. and be able to advance towards one of those two end zones based on the information that I've got. But for me to be able to go north or south, I've got to know what is out of norm and what is out of range for me to get there, if that makes any sense.
That makes sense. And you also have to keep in mind that baselines are going to be different. You're going to have one baseline that you're going to have for a nice annual holiday parade where we can work off the past. We know in the past that this has happened and this has happened, so we put guidelines in place to be able to deal with those events. Um, we know based on past events how many personnel need to be present, both uniform, plain clothes. So we work on that because we've already identified what the baseline was.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can say that we're going to have an event that has music after the parade. So we're going to have a baseline. We're going to expect a certain type of crowd is going to show up both for the parade and then maybe later on for the concert. So we'll know what our baseline is. Now, that's easy for a scheduled event. However, we don't have that advantage when we have something like a protest that breaks out, that we didn't have any recognition that was going to happen in the first place, where somebody is angry about something. It could be anything in the news today, like what's going on overseas, um, events in politics, events with abortion. And you're going to have people that show up, and we may not have a baseline already
Mm-hmm.
to deal with it because we don't know how many are going to show up, how long they're going to stay, whether or not they're going to be peaceful, whether or not there's going to be somebody inciting violence in the crowd.
And baselines are different. Let's just take three C's: churches versus campuses versus commerce. I mean, what's a baseline in a mall versus what's a baseline in Baton Rouge versus what's a baseline on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock during Sunday mass or whatever the case may be. Those baselines are going to be flexible, but at the same time, there's generally patterns and normal patterns that we're looking for to be able to, again, articulate what's out of that baseline so we can take an action, which is really the crux of the entire matter. Regardless of what those norms are in the baselines, though, it's important to think about, if I'm in a July 4th parade route, I pretty much know what should be going in and out throughout the parade. Some have schedules, some don't. But if there's I don't know, let's call it a 1999 Chevy pickup truck with no banners on it that's got sparks flying out of the back end of it because it's overweighted and it's coming close to the parade route, that's probably something we want to be acting on. And I think we can articulate why we did that based on baselines and norms of what's normal for that particular event. But again, you have to be able to make the case for it.
One of the analogies I like to use when I teach this spot class is when you have a sporting event going on, you're going to expect a certain type of crowd. Usually they're going to be in a good mood when they show up. They're excited. They're going to go see a sporting event. They're going to be dressed a certain way. They're probably going to be wearing the jerseys of the teams that are competing, either the home team or the away team that are at that event. You're going to have people that are going to be drinking alcohol. You should expect that. People are going to have to queue up to go through security lines. That is what we recognize, and I always use that as an example when I teach getting to know a baseline, because that's something that we're used to and we see all the time.
You see a lot of different things. Again, I come from a higher education world, so I would like to think that I've seen a couple of different nuances in my time. Our baselines, quite honestly, are different because they're so incredibly diverse. Every time I think I've seen it all, I haven't necessarily. At sporting events, if it's a Illinois-Michigan football game, I expect to see a lot of maize and blue and orange and blue, which are the corresponding colors to those teams. But if I'm seeing people, let's say it's a September day and it's still 95 degrees out with 78% relative humidity and everybody's sweating profusely, and I've got a couple of people that are coming out in full Chicago Bear sweatshirts and coats and hats and those kinds of things, that's a little bit out of the norm for what we'd be looking at. And if those things were observed, there'd be extra eyes put on those people for that reason. But within the realm of all these things, those events are going to be scalable. You're a Jets fan, correct, Eric? So give me
Nope,
one
not
normal.
anymore.
I thought you were a Jets fan.
Not anymore. No. Buffalo Bills.
Okay. Oh, Buffalo Bills. Okay. Gotcha.
Technically, they're the only New York team left. Real New York.
Technically, you're right. Yep, for sure.
Well, I think that's a good stopping place for this time. Next time, we'll continue our conversation with Todd and Eric about pre-operational behaviors. If you have any questions or topic suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at podcast@ncbrt.lsu.edu. Make sure you subscribe to the LSU NCBRT Preparedness Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and we'll see you again next time.